The Middle Eastern automotive industry sounds just as exotic as the car industry of North Korea. And yet, in both cases, it does exist. I have already made several in-depth videos about North Korea's automotive industry. Today, we are moving on to the Middle Eastern auto sector, specifically Iran's. Unlike North Korea's industry, which operates under heavy limitations and is closer to a formality than a full-scale sector, Iran's automotive industry is not a marginal niche or a hobby for enthusiasts. It ranks third in the country's economy in terms of profit and importance, right after oil and gas. And not long ago, Iran was among the 12 largest car-producing countries in the world. In this video, we will trace the development of this Persian country's automotive industry and examine whether sanctions have managed to break it. Iran's automobile industry is relatively young. In the 1950s, it barely existed in any meaningful form. Simple screwdriver assembly of trucks and a few foreign models could hardly be called a real automotive industry. The starting point of domestic production is usually considered to be 1962, when brothers Ahmad and Mahmoud Kayami founded Iran Khodro. However, they did not begin as car manufacturers. Their business initially focused on tires and automotive parts. The company grew quickly. By 1967, it had signed a licensing agreement with the British Rootes Group to produce the Hillman Hunter. In Iran, the car was renamed Paykan, and it was this model that soon became the country's first truly national automobile. The reasons behind this success were not accidental. First of all, the choice of prototype. The Hillman Hunter was a very average car. It was not a failure, but it was never a hit either. It competed in one of the most crowded segments of the European market and never felt entirely confident there. The car was old-fashioned, relatively expensive, and technically unremarkable. Compared to its rivals, it became outdated fairly quickly. In Iran, however, this exact type of car turned out to be perfectly suited to local conditions. Yes, it was already dated, but it was simple, mechanically straightforward, and easy to repair. With minimal electronics and a carbureted engine, it was well suited to a country still developing its infrastructure. Local assembly also made it affordable. The vehicle class itself was another important factor. By the late 1960s, a new middle class was emerging in Iran. Entrepreneurs, engineers, teachers. They needed a car that was not luxurious, but not basic either. Something respectable yet within reach. The Paykan met those expectations. But the decisive factor behind its dominance was state support. It is difficult to speak of a truly open market at that time. Imports were heavily restricted, and tariffs reached as high as 90%, making foreign cars effectively uncompetitive. At the same time, Iran Khodro received subsidies, and the government purchased Paykans for police forces, state agencies, and officials. The four-door sedan body style also made it practical for both government service and taxi fleets. As a result, what had been a very average car by European standards became an ideal solution for Iranian conditions. At the same time, Iran Khodro did not simply rely on protectionism. The company invested heavily in dealer networks, spare parts distribution, and service centers, ensuring that the Paykan could be maintained and repaired almost anywhere in the country. However, following the familiar pattern of regional monopolies, Iran Khodro was in no hurry to invest in serious upgrades or modernization of the Paykan. There was little incentive to do so. Year after year, the market situation remained unchanged. There were almost no alternatives, and the Paykan continued to sell well. The only truly significant update came in the early 1990s, when the Paykan began receiving Peugeot engines. Even this was not the result of Iran Khodro's own initiative. It was largely caused by the fact that the British Rootes Group had been taken over by Peugeot. Cooperation with the French manufacturer led Iran Khodro to launch production of several Peugeot models and gradually shift its technological base in that direction. Meanwhile, the Paykan remained in production for so long that the Iranian government eventually had to officially ask the company's management to discontinue the outdated and environmentally unfriendly model. By that time, it was already 2005. The car was finally removed from the production line, but it did not disappear. First, the entire Paykan assembly line was sold and shipped to Sudan, where, according to some reports, Production continued for years afterward. Second, Iranian manufacturers themselves were in no hurry to abandon such a profitable platform. As a result, a peculiar hybrid emerged, the body of the Peugeot 405, mounted on the technical foundation of the Paykan. By that time, Iran Khodro was already mature enough to develop its own car. Since the relatively modern Peugeot 405 had been produced in Iran since the early 1990s, the company decided to base its first in-house model on this platform. The initial version was called Peugeot Pars, and its exterior was slightly restyled to resemble the more modern 406. However, the company's most interesting project became its own creation, the Samand. As one might expect, the Samand was a deeply modernized version of the French sedan, although at first glance this was hardly noticeable, either inside or outside. The localization level of the Samand reached around 80%, which allowed it to be legitimately described as a national car. In addition to standard gasoline versions, it was also produced with a factory-installed gas system. The Samand also relied on government support, although in a much less direct way than during the era of the Shah. State orders and high import tariffs remained in place, while the most favorable credit and installment programs were directed specifically toward this model. At the same time, the Samand was actively exported to neighboring countries and even to Eastern Europe. For example, in Ukraine it competed quite successfully with local Lanos models and Chinese cars. Sales were never outstanding, but nevertheless, Samand assembly was established in 5 countries outside Iran. One important detail is that automobile development and production in Iran are regulated at the state level. In the early 2000s, the Ministry of Industry, Mines, and Trade launched a strategic development program for the national automotive sector. This approach attracted the attention of many European and Asian manufacturers. Both longtime partners from PSA and other major players in the budget segment became interested in setting up production in Iran. Once again, the fastest to respond were the French, this time from Renault. In 2004, a joint Iranian-French venture was established at the Pars Khodro plant, where production of the budget Logan model began. On the local market, it was sold under the name Tandar. In practice, this was its main difference from the European version. Pars Khodro, however, was not just another manufacturer. It was the oldest automotive plant in Iran, founded in the 1950s as a private company. It had previously been responsible for the screwdriver assembly of trucks, as well as Nissan Patrol and Jeep off-road vehicles. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, however, Pars Khodro and Saipa, another Iranian automaker that we will discuss later, found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. Sanctions were imposed on the country, and many Western companies began terminating contracts with Iranian partners and the government. In contrast, Iran Khodro started building cooperation with PSA at an early stage, through large-scale agreements and joint ventures. And frankly speaking, the French were not eager to abandon a promising market. Instead, they looked for ways around the restrictions, and eventually found them. Smaller manufacturers such as Pars Khodro and Saipa were not so fortunate. Most of their international cooperation had to be scaled back, even though many of their contracts were also linked to French companies. Saipa is the second most important automaker in Iran. The company was founded in 1966 and initially produced cars under license from Citroën, starting with the Diane. However, as with many other French projects, these licenses and contracts were later terminated. In 1981, some sanctions against Iran were lifted, but in 1984 and 1987, new restrictions were imposed. This unstable policy hit the company hard. While the Iranian automotive industry as a whole was shifting toward import substitution, Saipa decided to reorient itself toward Asian partners. At that time, South Korea pursued a pragmatic foreign economic policy and was not yet as tightly integrated into the Western Bloc as it would become later. While formally supporting its allies, the country remained heavily dependent on exports and was desperately searching for new markets. Today, Kia is a global automotive giant, but in the 1980s it was still a regional player, with weak exports, unstable finances, and strong dependence on licenses from Ford and Mazda. For Kia, cooperation with Iran was not so much a political risk as a chance for survival. As a result, Saipa acquired a license for the Kia Pride. The Pride, much like the Hillman Hunter in earlier decades, fit perfectly into Iranian reality. Simple, cheap, and even primitive, it was exactly the kind of car the country needed in the 1990s. In addition, the Koreans proved far more flexible in their licensing conditions. Kia allowed local production of body panels, engines, and gearboxes, as well as independent modifications of the base model, something French manufacturers were usually reluctant to permit. Later, based on this Korean platform, Iranian engineers developed the Tiba, equipping it with a more powerful engine and a completely new body, while retaining the original platform. Like the Samand, the Tiba eventually moved beyond the Middle East and attempted to establish itself in parts of Eastern Europe, competing with local and Chinese manufacturers. On the domestic market, Iran Khodro and Saipa together produce more than 90% of all vehicles in the country, leaving only a small share to smaller manufacturers. For many years, the automotive sector was one of the most dynamically developing branches of the Iranian economy, generating export revenue and attracting foreign investment. It is no surprise that until 2012, Iran was the largest car producer in the Middle East and ranked 12th in the world, exporting vehicles worth roughly $1 billion per year. Everything changed after sanctions were imposed by the United States and the European Union over the country's nuclear program. Iran's refusal to scale back its research led to tighter international restrictions, and the automotive industry became one of the main targets. In 2010, Toyota completely halted exports to Iran. Soon afterward, German manufacturers followed. Under pressure from Washington, even the French, traditionally strong players in the Iranian market, withdrew. By early 2012, among the major international partners, only Chinese companies remained, and they were actually expanding their presence. The sanctions dealt a serious blow to the industry, and production volumes declined sharply. Yet the Iranian automotive sector survived. Modern models may still fall short of global leaders, but within its region, Iran remains one of the key producers and continues to export vehicles to friendly and neutral countries. I would like to end with a personal assessment and give credit to the Iranians. When I first began researching this video, I had the impression that Iran's automotive industry would be something almost caricature-like, similar to North Korea's. I expected a story about outdated cars, produced without meaningful modernization, and an industry surviving more out of inertia than strength. But paragraph by paragraph, skepticism gradually gave way to respect. In essence, despite living under sanctions for nearly half a century, Iran managed to build an automotive industry whose scale many countries that have never faced sanctions and have had access to global investment, could only dream of. Yes, in a fully open market, the situation would likely look very different. But we should not forget that this is the Middle East, with its own political, economic, and cultural realities. Thank you for watching. Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.